Did you know that lobster used to be considered like a trash food in New England? So lobster's been around for forever. Like it's all across the world. You can get it in a lot of different places, not too many different species, but along the New England shoreline, it's always been particularly plentiful. So prior to the colonial era, the Algonquian-speaking peoples that lived along the New England coast, they used to regularly eat lobster because it was super easy. There'd be a storm, it would wash a bunch of lobster up onto the shore, they'd pick it up off the ground, and then they'd just throw it on the fire and cook it. When the Pilgrims arrived, unlike the Native Americans that lived there, they sucked at feeding themselves because they were trying to apply their English food, their growing techniques to the New World, which just didn't work. So for the first few winters, they were just starving to death all the time. And the one thing that would have been really plentiful all year round would have been lobster. And so if you try and picture what just an entire shoreline of slowly rotting lobster would smell like, and the fact that that's the only thing you get to eat for a few years, you might understand why the New Englanders would start to hate lobster. It was literally something that they would feed to cattle. And there are these possibly apocryphal stories about prisoners in jails complaining about all the lobster they were being fed. So, what changed? There were two things. So when the Civil War started, the Union Army had the same problems that every army has. They needed to get their troops to the front lines, and they needed to feed their troops. And so there were two new technologies, relatively new technologies, that were used to kind of facilitate this process. One of them was canning. So, canning food was relatively new, and what they realized is they needed a good, cheap food that was plentiful and that possibly the locals didn't want to eat all that much of. And so they got lobster, and then they would cook it up, and then they'd can it, and then they'd put it on the railroads, which was the second technological innovation, and send it down to the Union soldiers fighting in the army. And when the war was over, those railroads still needed to be used for some reason. They were there now, and they didn't need to ship stuff down to the military. So they started being used for commerce and also for tourism. And with the middle class and tourism kind of growing as a concept in the United States at that time, a lot of people started going up to Boston to what is now known as the Freedom Trail. And while they were there, many of them may have eaten lobster from a can when they were fighting in the army. And then they tried it in Boston and in New England. And what the New Englanders did is what all townies do to all tourists, which is they laughed while they sold this trash food to the tourists at marked up prices. But the tourists realized something that the natives had forgotten, which is that lobster is delicious. And so it became in demand outside of New England. But because lobster is super expensive to ship, it ended up becoming a luxury food. I talk more about food taboos on today's Amuse Bouche Substack and podcast. Tag below.